Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I'm Steve, your host, producer, writer, videographer, and really anything else you need me to do. We are always on Facebook and Twitter, and you can find both by searching for A2Z History. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can always send me an email to my email address, steve@atozhistorypage.com. You can also leave a comment at my website, a2zhistorypage.com. I just want to quickly welcome the newest member of the Agora Podcast Network, Nia Clark, who hosts a podcast called The Black Wall Street 1921. You can learn more about Nia's show at agorapodcastnetwork.com. I just want to thank everyone for all of their support, and let's get right to it. Christian history is fascinating to me. I suppose it must be otherwise. I wouldn't be spending all this time making a podcast on the history of the popes of Rome and Christian church. If anyone has listened to this podcast or watched the accompanying videos from the Study of Antiquity in the Middle Ages YouTube channel, then you would know my interests go far beyond strictly talking about just the popes of Rome. One thing I've learned in researching this podcast is that there's many influences that have guided Christian history. There were the great men, so to speak, as well as trends and social influences that impacted the course of events in papal and church history. These people don't necessarily represent the official hierarchy of Christianity. In some cases, they were even opposed to Christianity. In other cases, these leaders were on the side of early Christianity, but had conflicts with the Christian theologians and top-ranking hierarchs. This episode is an extended version of the episode that was posted on YouTube on the Study of Antiquity in the Middle Ages with a bit more detail and information added. So you should definitely check out the video, which goes well with this episode. So our number 4 on the list is Diocletian, and Diocletian is a great place to start. Christianity from a very early time was termed an illicit religion or illegal to practice religion. And in the mid to early 200s, there's evidence of small scale persecutions. And it was usually when the government would compel all citizens to sacrifice to the emperor or something to that effect. But it was usually a localized phenomenon. Christians, from their religious perspective, were prohibited from doing such actions as sacrificing to the emperor or making oaths to the emperor. Often enough, offenders who didn't participate might be censured or even executed. There was a wide range of punishments. Christians also couldn't openly be in the government or the army, etc. at this point. After these persecutions, though, up to about the mid-200s, Christianity goes into a certain period where it's not necessarily legal to be Christian, but it's not a persecuted religion either. And this is called the Great Peace of the Church, which lasted about 50 years. During this time period, many people converted. The Christian population of the empire absolutely exploded. It's not a huge percentage overall, but it's becoming significant. Possibly as high as 30% of the total population of the empire. That's like the absolute highest number in a range of statistics. It's not easy to say with any certainty numbers, but it could be as low as 5, as high as 30. The religion also made inroads with all levels of society, included high-level officials, the wealthy, and their families. The percentages of Christians were highest in the cities and in the eastern half of the empire. In parts of the Eastern Empire, the population was very high in percentage terms. And that's really weighting when we look at these numbers, especially these 30% numbers, weighted very highly in the Eastern Empire, less so as you get out west, which these are all things that we've discussed extensively in the podcast. One of the examples is in the plague of Cyprian, where the population of Christians in the beginning was very low, but by a century later, you're talking about maybe 25, 30% in a place like Carthage, 25 to 30% of an area going from a tiny minority of maybe less than 5% to going to 25% is demographically a huge change. During this time, though, in the empire, this mid to late 200s, the empire is politically going through something called the crisis of the 3rd century. The Roman Empire broke up into several separate political entities under various revolts. And this very well could have been the end of the line for the Roman Empire. There was really much instability, and finally an emperor named Aurelian. I changed this in the video episode. I called him Aurelius, but it was actually Aurelian. So I thank you to the YouTube commenter who corrected me on that. I'm always willing to take some corrections, and I often do include points of correction or things that people dislike about the format of the show. I consider all of your feedback, so I love it, and definitely don't hesitate to send me an email on that to steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Anyway, this Aurelian brought the empire back together in 275, but there's still much instability militarily, economically, governmentally. This is a difficult time in the empire. This is whenever Diocletian takes over, and he's from a poor backwater in the Balkans, possibly the child of slaves, but he was a very talented military commander and rose quickly through the ranks, and he wound up to become a governor of a province and a high-level administrator. When the previous emperor was murdered, Diocletian was named emperor by the army, as they're wont to do. He institutes something called the Tetrarchy, or the Rule of Four, in which Diocletian divides the empire into four, or divided the empire into four, with two main parts, each with one subordinate quarter. The two subordinate parts were led by a Caesar who answered to an Augustus. Diocletian was Augustus of the East, and he was kind of the top dog of this group of equals. Diocletian instituted many reforms of the economy and the religion. I won't get into the reforms of the economy, but I have in other episodes. Now, for the religious reforms, it's really, he had an idea as a means to stabilize the empire, and stability was the key. Everyone was to worship the same gods and the same emperor. It's really bursting through the ceiling of emperor being the first among equals and the first citizens. Now the emperor is becoming kind of like a semi-divine being. It's really raising the emperor's stock. Now these Christians, they didn't agree with the policy. And after so many years of peace, they started to feel a little emboldened to push back a bit. First off, Diocletian got the idea to persecute the Manichaeans. Then that persecution moved on to the Christians in the early first decade of the 300s. The level of persecution was highly localized. In the East, it was brutal, and there's many examples of burnings, tortures, destruction of property, of both physical immovables, if you will, as well as books and all sorts of other things. This was less common in the West. There's less persecution. Some of the leadership was inclined to support Christians, such as Constantius Chlorus, who was Constantine the Great's dad. Finally, in 305, Diocletian retired. The persecutions continued under his successor. The short story is the tetrarchy system started to fall apart in their civil war. Eventually, this is a long story cut short for sure, but eventually Constantine the Great won out, and he issued a document called the Edict of Milan, which ensured religious freedom for all, especially Christians in the empire. We'll talk a bit more about some of these characters in a minute, so don't you worry. But anyways, before we do that, what were the influences of Diocletian on early Christianity? The persecution brought Christian factions together temporarily. It also stoked some major splits and schisms that never completely healed. And most of these schisms revolved around whether people sacrificed or not, or committed oaths to the emperor during this time. If people in clergy sacrificed, were they out of the religion? Could they get back into the religion? This set the terms for, it set the terms for how religion was viewed in the West. A state should have one religion to keep everyone together. If state-sponsored persecutions were necessary to meet these ends, well, then that's what happens. The secular leadership should also be involved heavily in religion. This is another theme that we'll see over and over again after Diocletian. Also, there's major conflicts over the compromises to make Christianity work for all regions and the diverse population of the Roman Empire, which would rage for centuries. It's something that would always pop up. A version of Christianity that was good for Egypt might not necessarily line up with what the Romans felt. Pre-Diocletian, it didn't really matter. Everybody just did their own thing, and yeah, there were some squabbles, but you really had to work hard to be outside of the mainstream pre-Diocletian. That will change dramatically after Diocletian. Much more importantly, this ushered in the reign of Constantine. So let's talk about number 3, Constantine. Constantine was possibly the most important secular or non-religious leader in Christian history. Positive, period. Like positive, negative, you name it. He had a lot of influences, but I would say if he's not number 1 of the most important Christian leader, he's definitely in the top 4, so I guess he made it in the top 4. You'll see some reasons why I might have picked some other people and why he ranks number 3 in this particular list, but we'll get to that. Quickly on his background, we've tread the ground. We walked the podcasting grounds with Constantine quite a bit, so any of it won't be a shock. But he came from a Balkan military family, and many of the military leaders of his time came from the Balkans. Diocletian is an example. Constantine's father, Constantius Chlorus, was an important general and part of Diocletian's tetrarch plan. Diocletian wasn't included in the succession of the tetrarchy and wasn't happy about it. So when his dad died, Constantine took over control of his father's army, and he wound up taking most of the West fairly quickly. Now, we have to talk about this famous conversion story. Again, if you listen to the podcast, you know a lot of the details, but let's just skim over it quickly. We talk about the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in Rome in the year 312. And the night before the battle, Constantine saw a cross in the sky that said, "In the sign conquer." There's issues with the story, with the historiography of the story. Constantine's mother, Helena, was probably a Christian since Constantine was a child. Constantine wasn't a Christian himself, at least not officially, but he was really raised and steeped in a very Christian background. Christianity didn't just fall out of the sky on him in 312. He was very familiar with the religion. He probably even had a personal theology at that time too. Constantine went on and won this major battle of the Milvian Bridge and took over the western end of the empire. He also issued his famous Edict of Milan, which made freedom of worship, specifically legalizing Christianity. That was the whole point of it, at least. Constantine went and won battles all across the East, and by 325, Constantine was the last man standing and sole emperor of the Roman Empire, a united Roman Empire. In 325, Constantine wanted to organize Christianity to be completely unified and unified behind him. Christianity had divisions since the beginning. By this time, Orthodoxy or mainstream Christianity really divided into two camps, the subordinationists or the Arians versus the Trinitarians. So the subordinationists, in this case, Jesus, it was not or is not equal to God the Father or made of the same substance, maybe of similar substance, but not quite the same. In the Trinitarians, God the Father, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are all equal and of one substance, nature, or essence. Constantine's own personal beliefs lean something more towards subordinationism. Constantine called a council that was supposed to represent the totality of Christianity. It was supposed to be ecumenical, from a Greek word meaning universal, or really, household, but like the entire household of Christianity. It's kind of related to that idea in Islam of the world's broken into houses. Really, in the ancient world, there's a lot of metaphor towards the household being sort of a universal concept. Anyways, this ecumenical council was held in a resort town called Nicaea. Probably, you'd say it more something like Nicaea, but we're not going to split hairs here. The goal of the council was to bring all the Christian factions together under one unified theology, kind of smooth off the rough edges. The Trinitarians won the day at the council. Constantine backed the council despite the differences in opinion that he had with them. Constantine eventually was baptized by Eusebius, bishop of the newly built Constantinople, and Constantine had a deathbed baptism, which was common at this time. A lot of people kind of throw that out there. Oh, he wasn't baptized until the last minute, but that was a very common thing in Christianity up till that point. You didn't get baptized a week after you go to your church for the first time, and infant baptism was getting popular amongst people who had already been converted themselves. But a lot of times people would also hold out until the bitter end, so to speak, so that you're completely clear before you get into a salvation situation. Now let's talk about what was Constantine's influence on Christianity. Well, it was huge, easily the most important non-religious figure on Christianity. Constantine impacted every stage of Christianity from antiquity to the modern ages and the modern times. He sponsored major church buildings like the original Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, the Lateran Cathedral in Rome, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He called the first major worldwide council of the Christian Church, which was fairly representative of all of mainstream Christianity. Even a few groups outside of the mainstream were represented. That this Council of Nicaea in 325 and the creed that came from it is the defining statement of close to all Christians today. The Roman Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, the Oriental Orthodox, and almost every single Protestant group uses Nicene Creed as its basic statement of beliefs. Constantine furthered the idea Diocletian had for religion and state being combined. It really gives the Western world its understanding of a church and a state and that they're related. It defined this relationship all throughout the Middle Ages, and it cast a long shadow well into the modern period. Constantine favored Christianity in a way that made the population explode. Christians as a minority in the early 300s led into the 400s, where they're turning into the vast majority of the population in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Western Europe was really the Johnny-come-lately, but eventually would embrace Christianity. For better or for worse, Constantine catapulted Christianity to what it would become. Why he's not the number one today, well, maybe I'm trying to be a little controversial, or a little, maybe trying to think and do a thought experiment for myself even, and maybe to push all of us just a little bit of some other people who are very close to being very highly influential on Christianity, and some other players who I want to give a little bit more of the spotlight to, because Constantine's a little obvious, but we will see. Let's talk about number 2, Muawiya. I bet you're a little shocked. Muawiya. I personally didn't even expect to put Muawiya on this list. I can honestly say, up until doing some research for episodes that are upcoming, he was not a historical household name for me, really, until I started reading much more about the Arab conquest, Islam, and the 600s and 700s in Christianity and in the Western Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, that it changed my opinion. Now, Muawiya was an important leader of the early Arab armies and would found an extremely important dynasty, the Umayyad Caliphate. Caliph or Caliph means in Arabic successor to the Prophet Muhammad. The Umayyad was the very earliest dynasty of Islam. Right after the succession crisis of the direct relatives in the inner circle of Muhammad, these were what they would call and what they call the Rashidun, or rightly guided successors. The Umayyad Caliphate lasted in the Middle East and in Africa until the mid to late 700s, and it actually continued in Islamic Spain for a few centuries after that. Muawiya more than likely knew the historical Muhammad according to later Islamic sources. He was also from an important Arabian tribe. That's where a lot of the big time names in early Islam came from, were important tribal groups in the Saudi Arabia, modern day Saudi Arabia. They were important in government, economics, trade, and everything the above. They, tight-knit, close families. That's a major theme and really in history up until even today now, people keep things tight in the family because that's a good way to protect power. But anyways, Muawiya was a general and governor. He connects to all of the big names in the very earliest of Islam. As Islam exploded out of the Arabian Peninsula, Muawiya was in his youth, and this is where things like the Battle of Yarmouk happened, and the Arabs conquer Syria, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and just keep steamrolling through everybody else who gets in their way. There's major conquests of Eastern Roman territory, and these are the keys to Muawiya and the Arabs' influence on this era of Christianity, which would have a long shadow. The Eastern Roman Empire at this point equals Christianity. Everything with Eastern Roman politics was inextricably linked with Christianity. Everything Christian leadership did was, in return, inextricably linked to Eastern Roman politics. The two are completely inseparable. We won't go into all the details, but under Muawiya and the Umayyads, we see several things. They conquered all of North Africa, from Egypt to Libya, and then the rest of the Macabre, eventually all the way into Spain and even parts of southern France. They put the Byzantines on a major defensive, along with completely wiping out the Visigothic kingdom, which was a powerful kingdom in Western Europe. One you would not, if you try and put yourself into the time period, you wouldn't expect the Visigoths to be the ones to, get completely wiped out. It was a very difficult time on the sea for the Byzantines. The Umayyads, and especially beginning with Muawiya, they would control the seas. They would own the seas. The sea was as important to own militarily then as it is to have air superiority now. This all happened at a major battle called the Battle of the Masts, and it was a major defeat for the Byzantines, and that made them lose their supremacy of the sea. It put a major strain on the city of Constantinople. This also put a big target on the city of Constantinople. Unfortunately for Muawiya, or fortunately for the Constantinopolitans, there's a few unsuccessful sieges, but the sieges are very bad. They were bad for business. They were bad for stability. They were terrible on the population. In the end, even though the Arabs did not take Constantinople, they would press on and take major Mediterranean islands and push into Europe proper. Now, what were the influences of Muawiya and the Umayyad on Christianity? Obviously, Muawiya's influences were indirect. What happened was these conquests further exacerbated certain factors that were already impacting Christianity. Many Greeks and Syrians had fled the east because of the Byzantine wars with the Persians. People like Maximus the Confessor, even though he died about the year before Muawiya took over the control of the nascent empire, he was one of these people who moved. Many other learned Christian monks and scholars, along with a lot of wealthy and rich families, that's when they fled. Is as the Umayyads pushed on, they moved on, and they kept leapfrogging further west. We're not sure of Muawiya's interest or relation with Christianity. Islam at this point was still a project that was very much under construction. The theology and foundations of the religion were still being developed. Islam was heavily influenced by pan-Arab paganism, Judaism, and Christianity, and they all left their stamp of influence on the religion, but Islam was also adding its stamp on these other religious groups as well. Now, Muawiya and the Arab armies and their conquests, they had some direct influences on Christianity as well. Spanish Christianity went through major changes. The Visigothic rite was pushed to the margins, and within a very short time, Christianity in Western North Africa would be completely gone. A heartland of Christianity. I don't think anybody could argue that Carthage and North Africa truly was the heartland of Western Christianity. Now, it's gone there's some scholars that would say that, like, you're talking like the 800-900s, Christianity's like not even, there's barely any Christians there. Really, they have reference to Christians being in North Africa until maybe about the year 1000, but after that, it's pretty much gone. Egyptian Christians and many Middle Eastern Christians, these Miaphysites and Monophysites, they would become completely independent and separate from Roman Imperial Christianity and the Roman Imperial Christian Church. Rome was also a major beneficiary. So many scholars and monks of Greek and Syrian descent came to Rome and Italy. They raised the level of scholarship in Rome tremendously. Rome started off this period as a backwater in the major theological debates, but by the 7th century, it's the driver of these debates, a major intellectual powerhouse. This wouldn't have happened if the Arabs, well, and even the Persians, let's give the Persians a little of their due, hadn't destabilized the Levant in the Eastern Mediterranean. The conquests of the Arabs gave the West political and religious independence from the Eastern Roman Empire. That allowed the West to grow and develop the institutions that we know today. It's really when they say that Islam reintroduced classical learning to the West. I know I've said this. I sound like a broken record on this. They did, but they did it hundreds of years before what you would commonly think. By them pushing these scholars from their homelands in the Middle East into Greece proper, Constantinople, Rome, Sicily, Magna Graecia, the southern part of the peninsula of Italy. This is when classical learning is really getting back into a Roman Empire that had forgotten, a Western Latin former Roman Empire that had largely forgotten a lot of these things. And now they're starting to come back then. Muawiya and his descendants' influence on Christianity wasn't planned, but it carries through history all the same. All right, we've come this far. We might as well talk about number one. Number one for me, he was in a battle. I'm going to say we had a little bit of a Christian fight club, to toss back to the American History Fanatics Presidential Fight Club. We had a Christian leader fight club between Constantine and Charlemagne, and I really had to pick Charlemagne is number one, even though it was a very tough decision. But let's talk about Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, Karl der Grosse, and why it was such a tough decision, but why he wins by just a nose. Charlemagne is known as the father of Europe. He's one of the most important figures in European and political religious history of all times. His actions went a long way to creating the Europe we know today. For better and sometimes worse, everything in the West and even the European Union, the political entity, has a strong mark of Charlemagne on it. Before we get too far on his influence, where did Charlemagne come from? What was his background? Well, he was the grandson of Charles the Hammer Martel. Charles the Hammer defeated a major Arab invasion, which could have been an invasion or a reconnaissance in force. That's a debatable thing that I'm sure we'll discuss in future episodes, at the Battle of Tours in 732. It's a pretty big deal in Western European lore right there. Like, boom, we're done. But let's go on. Charlemagne was the son of Pepin the Short. Pepin, I wonder if they call it Pepin in French. I'm not sure. I'm guessing yes, but I'll go with Pepin, even though I kind of like the sound of Pepin. Pepin was the highest ranking officer of the Merovingian Frankish court. He basically took over in a soft coup and got the Pope in Rome to back him up and bless the takeover. He was also anointed king of the Franks and founded the Carolingian dynasty of the Franks. This made the Franks big-time allies of the papacy, especially with the papacy's big-time enemies, the Lombards. It was very helpful for the papacy to have the Franks as their protector and their big brother standing behind them. The Franks at that point began to replace the Byzantines as the papacy's benefactor. Pepin donated a huge amounts of recently conquered Lombard land to the papacy. Charlemagne was a young lad and in his early teens during this period. This is where the donation of Constantine comes into play. This is supposedly a document where Constantine the Great gave the papacy a huge amount of power over the area of central Italy. The papacy gave back the power temporarily to the Roman Empire under Constantine, but it never relinquished its claim. This was, of course, all a gigantic lie, and the donation of Constantine was a complete forgery. Pepin didn't know this, though. He was illiterate and had to trust his priest and his advisors. Who, you might ask yourself, did his priests and advisors have all the incentive in the world to back? Well, the papacy, of course. Anyway, back to Charlemagne. He became co-king of the Franks with his brother. He put down a bunch of internal revolts. Eventually, he became the sole king of the Franks when his brother died. That's the Franks and German, these Germans at that time's big problem. They didn't have this idea where the eldest son becomes the sole king of the realm. They went and split up all of their lands equally amongst any legitimate sons they had. So you could see how this could cause problems, and it caused massive problems in European history in the times after Charlemagne. Anyhow, Charlemagne aggressively expanded the kingdom of the Franks. He expanded to the east into the Balkans and modern-day Hungary and Austria. He even gives Austria the name in Austria, they don't call themselves Austria, they call themselves Österreich, or the Eastern Kingdom. He also gave the Reconquista in Spain a kickstart by conquering a small sliver of land in the far north of Spain that would steadily grow and push back the Arab conquests. At the behest of the papacy, he defeated the Lombard kingdoms in northern Italy. He also pushed hard on this group called the Saxons to the north and eventually conquered them and converted them en masse. In 800, on Christmas Day, he was crowned Emperor of the Romans. Boom! That's a huge deal. It's the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. This is supposedly the recreation or the reinstatement of the Roman Empire, even though people often say that it wasn't holy and it wasn't Roman and it wasn't an empire. It also wasn't the successor of the Roman Empire that was actually in existence called the Eastern Roman Empire, which we also call it the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines, or whatever you want to call them, they didn't call themselves any of the above. They called themselves the Roman Empire. And obviously, even at the time, the emperors of Rome and Constantinople did not see this as a reinstatement of the Roman Empire in any way. Let's talk about the influences of Charlemagne. There's almost nothing in the 1200 years since Charlemagne that doesn't have some sort of stamp of Charlemagne on it. For one, if you are of any European extraction, or even not in some cases, you are a direct descendant of Charlemagne. That's pretty cool, but it's not a big deal, though. It's not a major stamp. But if you went to school, Charlemagne's reforms of the Western European education system do affect you. Under him, minuscule letters or lowercase letters were invented. There's major reforms of literacy. Charlemagne was illiterate himself, but he wanted others to be able to read. He needed an army of literate administrators to administer his empire. That army in any empire is as important as the guys who hold swords. Another thing that Charlemagne did was an important push of Latin as the lingua franca of the church and of administration. The emphasis was taken away from Greek, which was very heavily used in Rome at this time. It also pushed the vernacular, which was used commonly for church administration and ecclesiastical affairs in places like Anglo-Saxon England and Visigothic Spain. It pushed those way to the margin, and it really wouldn't be for several hundred years later that the vernacular, like I said, English in our case, and the Italian that people actually spoke, and the Spanish that people actually spoke, that these regional languages would start to come to the fore and challenge Latin as the language of economics and of academics, church usage, etc., etc., etc. The Holy Roman Empire would develop into the powerhouse of the entire medieval period. It was powerful even into the post-Reformation and early modern period. Powers and deals that Charlemagne made with the papacy in the 800 marked the relationship the church would have in the West and have with the state for the next 1,000 years. All the way even into World War I, the lines that were drawn to split Charlemagne's kingdom would mirror the fighting between Germany and France and that gray area in between, all the way up until the 19-teens. Charlemagne is considered the father of Europe, but he's also the father of Western Latin Roman Catholic Christianity and the Western Latin Roman Catholic Church and all of these institutions that survive today. And to me, that makes him the number one influencer of Christianity. I really thank you for listening to this episode today. I'd love to hear your comments on my top 4 influencers of Christianity, and if there's anybody who maybe you would add or take away. These are all fascinating conversations, and I think that's why I like to do things like these top 4 lists, because they really do bring up a lot of conversation. Anyways, I really do look forward to talking to you next time.